So, hello, I'm Rob Fields. I'm the Director for UNE Sydney, and our co-host is Sarah Morgan from the Parramatta Chamber Board. She's a member of the board. Sarah also runs the business as an executive leadership facilitator and is a specialist in boosting team performance and organisational productivity through their culture, team and leaders. So I'd also like to welcome members from the Taree Business Chamber, the Tamworth Business Chamber, Armidale Business Chamber, and of course the Parramatta Chamber, and my colleagues from UNE. It's great to see such a fantastic... It's great to see such a fantastic group come together today. I'd also like to acknowledge the Parramatta Federal member, Julie Owen. So good morning, Julie. Julie's a member of the Education and Employment House Committee and the Corporation and Financial Services Joint Standing Committee. Julie is the Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for Small Business and Early Childhood Education, and she was also a small business owner. We had Chris Bowen speaking in Armidale last night, which was great as part of our Earl Page parliamentary lecture program, which was good to hear. Also, Shawn Condon, our president of the Parramatta Chamber. I'd like to acknowledge acknowledgement of country. So appreciating that we're connecting virtually, this means we're all on different traditional country of many groups. For those of you attending today in Parramatta and Sydney, we're acknowledging the Darug people and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which extends from the Sydney coastline to the foothills of the Blue Mountains. I'd also like to extend this respect to anyone on the call today who is Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and to elders past, present and emerging. So cultural identities are extremely important for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They represent different heritage, languages, cultural practices, spiritual beliefs and geographic areas. The University of New England values and respects Indigenous knowledge systems as a vital part of the knowledge capital of Australia. So thank you. It's just great that we've got some fantastic speakers today, and I'd like to start, and I will introduce Dr. Shawn Liu, who's our first speaker this morning. Shawn is with our Senior Lecturer of Macroeconomics at our UNE Business School. His research interests are in applied macroeconomics, open economy macroeconomics, monetary economics and international finance. He's previously taught at La Trobe University and has held visiting positions at the International Monetary Fund, Macquarie Uni and the University of Cincinnati. Shawn has written and contributed to a number of publications and published a book on exchange rate management and monetary policy in Australia. So welcome, Shawn, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob, and good morning, everyone. Let me just now share my slides. And I hope you can all hear me okay. Just give me a few. Okay, thank you again and good morning. And I'd like to take about 10 to 15 minutes to share with you some thoughts and perspectives I have about the federal budget this year in 2020. Obviously, that this is a budget that the government has to contend with the first recession for the Australian economy in almost 3 decades. To put the magnitude of this current recession in perspective, the current one is 3 times as large the previous biggest fall of 2% in 1974. So let me start by looking at the cost of lower real GDP that has been inflicted on the Australian economy and then the projected pace of recovery. What I have here on the slide, as you can see, I find it interesting that the projection from the RBA back in August and the more recent one prepared by the Treasury recently. And what you can see here is that with the RBA diagram that it actually shows with this gray trend line here, this would be how GDP will continue to proceed without the COVID shock. And they've provided a few different scenarios. And obviously with the more optimistic scenario that they will have the speed the fastest for GDP to actually come back up to the pre-shock trend around the end of 2022.
Shawn, your slide's not rotating, so if you want to, it
Can
didn't
you say
move.
that again?
Your slide didn't move to the next slide, so.
Oh, okay. I can actually see that. Is that?
We just got your first slide, the federal budget 2020, some macro perspectives.
Okay, it's actually showing on my end that the slide is actually progressing.
Okay.
You want to try and reshare or look at your screen as if there's another presentation on your computer.
Hang on a sec.
Yep, so we can see that now, that one.
I think
You
you
can
got
see
it.
that. You can see that now.
Yeah.
Um,
GDP and real GDP.
okay. What about? Oh, okay. So essentially that. You know, by the end of 2022, we should see GDP coming back very close to the pre-COVID shock trend line. And if you look at the forecast prepared by the Treasury on the right-hand side, that seems to correspond to the forecast that that's boosted by economic support measures. Now, can you see that the slide is progressing to the next one?
Yep.
Okay, great. If we actually take a look at the 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP this year, then it sums up to a minus 7.3%. That's quite significant and sizable. So 0.3% in the March quarter, another 7% in the June quarter. When we compare ourselves to other major economies around the world, there are other cases where, you know, there's very odd sense of comfort that we do see much larger cumulative falls in other economies, say the British and the Spanish economies. Partly this is a function of the severity of pandemic playing out in those countries. Another measure of looking at the macroeconomic toll that the pandemic has wreaked on the economy is the rise in the unemployment. Here, there again, on the left, I have the RBA scenario, and on the right, I have the Treasury forecast. The optimistic scenario has the economy returning to 6% unemployment rate, and that is consistent with government support measures by June 2023. And this also happens to be arguably an artificial goal set by the government before considering winding back some stimulus measures, you know, for the purpose of starting to return the budget back to surplus. And if we continue with the labor market theme, this translates to lower employment and lower total and average hours worked. And you can see that this is contributing to rising underemployment, where people are employed, but they're screaming out for more working hours. And so essentially that the idea here is I like to build a picture that the first aim for policymakers, at least in the short term, is to stabilize the economy, to get the economy back to full employment output, which is that gray GDP line that you saw on the diagram. Now, there are 2 macroeconomic tools at the disposal of policymakers. Monetary policy, well, the conditions are extremely loose with the official policy rate at 0.25%, and essentially really running out of further expansionary room, and therefore that any heavy lifting will now be falling on fiscal policy to support aggregate demand through budget deficit. Now, we can divide this idea of the aggregate level of demand in the economy into spending that's coming from household consumption, foreign investment, government, and net exports, which is the external sector. And so if you look at the budget, I'm just going to talk broadly here. Some of the major stimulus measures are your infrastructure spending, business tax breaks, instant asset write-offs. There's wage subsidy for hiring young workers, for apprentices, grants to promote the 5 or 6 different areas of manufacturing that the government is hoping would set the scenes for manufacturing in Australia in the future, and also bringing forward the phase 2 of personal tax cuts. And of course, you know, this range of measures is designed to get the level of consumption and investment spending going. Now, this calibrated outcome crucially depends on three assumptions, which you may also think of them as potential risks if they don't play out right, which will reduce the effectiveness of the above stimulus measures. The first one, which is quite crucial, is the availability of a COVID vaccine, optimistically by the end of 2021. And then the pickup of net inward migration for Australia. And then also the easing of border restrictions, both domestically and internationally. And really that the first condition is probably the most crucial because a lot of the economic activities are being locked down in order to deal with this public health risk. So what I want to do here is I want to pick up on two additional factors for this short-term consideration of increasing spending and employment, so to get the economy back to this full employment GDP as soon as possible. The first consideration here, the first factor here is what's going to happen to confidence, household and firm confidence. It's going to dictate how strong and how quickly that the government hopes this private sector-led recovery will play out. If there is any sort of fracturing in the confidence level, households will then retreat to save more, firms will hold back their investment. And so the way that I think about this is that obviously confidence is circularly interconnected to the overall macroeconomic environment. And to me, crucially, to the development and availability of a COVID vaccine. Because it's going to give more clarity to how quickly economic activities can return to some normal, if not back to the old normal. The second factor I would like to sort of think about here is just to take up on discussion in some quarter as to how stimulatory would this tax cut be that's been brought forward, presumably through boosting consumption spending. Some have criticized that you know, the net result here is those that are on higher income brackets will receive a bigger tax cut. Now, that's in a way sort of based on this common assumption that lower income households, if you give them a bigger tax cut, then you know, these people tend to spend more proportionally when they have this additional income as a result of tax cuts. There's actually a very interesting overseas study that looks at a range of different countries, including Australia, and they actually focus on this particular group that the authors call hand-to-mouth households. So these are people who essentially have very little liquid wealth, and they tend to spend all of their resources every pay period. And in particular, within this hand-to-mouth household cohort, they actually focus on the wealthy hand-to-mouth household cohort. So the first thing that's very interesting coming from the study for Australia is that there's actually an unusual composition for Australia compared to other developed countries. Just under 20% of Australian households are actually classified as wealthy hand-to-mouth households. So these people are essentially cash poor, but asset rich. They have quite a bit of asset, illiquid asset that are tied up in real estate and their super accounts. But what's really interesting here is that these people actually exhibit very similar traits to poor hand-to-mouth households, in that if they receive a temporary increase in income, there is going to be a relatively huge increase in consumption spending. Additionally, that given that this tax cut is sort of permanent in terms of its implementation, one should also expect, at least, you know, theory would suggest that there will be high additional spending. So it'd be quite interesting to see how much more the multiplier effect that will come from this particular tax cut. Now, I would like to sort of talk about the second aspect of the budget measure and fiscal policy as I see it, which is, M1 was to get the economy back to full employment GDP as quickly as possible to stabilize the economy. Provided that task is fulfilled, then, which is akin to, because there is this very huge negative shock that has knocked the Australian economy back, and therefore that stabilization is such that we're trying to get back to the ability of producing that full employment GDP pie. And if we get back to that particular state, then the next task for fiscal policy is really to pursue the more long-term goal of how we can enlarge the production of this full employment GDP pie. So we can think of this as the promotion of economic growth. And there is actually a fairly simple sort of relationship to think about that. To get economic growth going, there are two fundamental drivers here. The first one is labor productivity growth, and the other one is labor force growth. So based on this, let me just talk about, pick up on two shortcomings that people have discussed in relation to the budget that was released last week. So in relation to labor productivity growth, I want to talk about briefly this climate energy policy. The budget contains measures on upgrading coal-fired power plants, the carbon capture technology, and also the gas industry, but comparatively small amount of spending on renewable energy. Now, this is in a way ties to the idea of an overall goal of zero carbon emission by 2050. Now, there is actually overseas studies have found that climate change features in terms of rising temperature and rainfall actually have a negative impact on labor productivity. Most of this is heat stress related. And one might think that, developing countries, poor countries would be disproportionately affected by climate change and how it will affect negatively on their labor productivity. But there is actually a study looking at US counties, so a rich developed country over the last 40 years. And what they actually found there is, with some quantification, is that the productivity per individual on a workday actually goes down by 1.7% for each 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature above 15 degrees. And for a workday that's about 30 degrees Celsius, it will actually cost that particular county an average of $20 per person in lost income. So there is actually a fairly sizable effect there, and it will accumulate over time. And obviously that the catastrophic bushfires we had here last summer in Australia and the bushfire in California this year, they're all very vivid reminders. Now, the second aspect of this in relation to labor force growth is the childcare subsidy, which is so glaringly absent in this year's budget to make childcare more affordable. This is a way to boost female labor force participation. According to the Grattan Institute, they think that if the government is to increase its spending on this for another $5 billion, it's a fairly good return, as they think that there's going to be an $11 billion boost to GDP for the Australian economy. But I think it's also a fairly important countermeasure to the forecast decline in population growth for Australia, coming from both fronts of low net migration, and there is going to be a drop in fertility rate. So I think that in sum, if the private sector does not pick up as quickly as the government hopes, then there is a need for the stimulus measure to continue to be put in place, but also that there may be an opportunity for the government come next May to think about broader measures that would promote, that would go address the different structure changes that are required for Australia. Okay, thank you very much. That's all I want to say.
Thanks very much, Shawn. Yes, certainly a number of points to think about and consider, so thank you. Our next speaker today is Stephen Halmarick. He's the Chief Economist and Head of Global Economics and Markets Research for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Thank you, Stephen, for coming along. He was appointed Chief Economist role in April 2020, having been the head of the Global Economic and Markets Research team since January 2018. Stephen is responsible for the team of economists and strategists that cover Australian economics, international economics, rates, fixed income, foreign exchange, credit and commodities research. And Stephen is also a key spokesperson to clients and media on macroeconomic themes and a broad range of financial market issues. So good morning, Stephen. Over to you. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, everybody. Hope you can hear me well. Thanks for the invitation to speak to you this morning. It's great to support the Parramatta Chamber and all the other chambers that you mentioned before. So I'm going to run through a few slides on our view on the budget, and then, of course, very happy to take some questions when we get to that. So I think someone's messaged to see the slides on the full screen. You need to click on the speaker view part of your screen, and hopefully it should pop up a little bit larger than I can see right now. So I'm going to try not to repeat, excuse me, many of the points that you've heard earlier. But this budget, the budget deficit is huge, $214 billion, so just short of. That's 11% of GDP, so 11% of the size of the economy. It's the largest budget deficit since World War II. So the chart on the left there shows actually our budget deficits back to federation. So you can see World War II and World War I stand out pretty clearly. So this is a very large budget deficit. And you can see on the right-hand side, that means a big increase in debt. So both the CGS on issue stands for Commonwealth Government Securities, so the bonds issued by the government to fund the deficit, and net debt in the blue line, the government's net debt, so rising very dramatically. Now, the point I want to make on that, and a couple of the charts here on the left-hand side are the same charts you've already seen from Dr. Liu, which is without the support from the budget, the economic outcome for Australia would have been considerably worse. So, in fact, our recession here, although it's a very deep recession, is a very good outcome compared to just about any other economy around the world. And that's because of the extent of the support that the government and the Reserve Bank, I should say also the banking system, has provided for the economy, and also the relative really great success we've had in controlling the spread of the virus. Even with the second wave in Victoria, we've done exceptionally well in controlling the spread of the virus. You look at the US and the UK and Europe, for example, they're actually getting record numbers now. So the chart on the right-hand side of this slide is really important. So the blue line is the increase in debt that I showed. And so debt of the government is increasing from about 25% of GDP to 44% of GDP. But the red line is the cost of that debt to the budget. So how much interest cost do they have to pay every year to fund that debt? And you can see that it's actually not rising. In fact, it's going down a little bit. So how is it that the volume of debt is rising dramatically, but the cost of that debt is not rising at all? And this is where we get to the nexus between the Reserve Bank and the government. So the Reserve Bank, as you heard earlier, has got the cash rate down at 25 basis points, so incredibly low, although there is some talk of that going even lower, down to maybe 10 basis points, so 0.1%. But the other thing the Reserve Bank doing is intervening in the government bond market, both Commonwealth bonds and state government bonds, to ensure that the cost of the borrowing from the government remains very low. So the Reserve Bank is ensuring that 3-year government bonds, so the interest rate the government is charged to borrow money for 3 years, is no more than 0.25% per year. And the government at the moment can borrow money for 10 years at about 0.8%, can borrow money for 30 years at about 1.6%. So the Reserve Bank is ensuring that outcome. And so the cost of the debt is going to be very low. And as I've got in the bold writing at the end of this slide, the economic return, excuse me, the economic return on that debt is going to far exceed the interest cost. So it's a really, really important point. So the strategy the government's pursuing on ramping up spending at these very low interest rates is, our view is that that's the right strategy. So this is just the budget numbers by number. So I won't go through each one of those, but you can see for this year down the bottom, as I mentioned, just short of $213 billion, $214 billion, and we still have deficits all the way out to 2024, but they are improving. So you can see from this chart on the left, the increase in spending is quite gigantic this year. As a share of GDP, we're jumping from 25% to almost 35%, but then it comes back down again quite quickly. So it's a lot of money this year. In fact, it's the new spending this year is $160 billion. So being pumped into the economy. And you can see on the right-hand side, the main measures. So the most expensive measure, the biggest measure, is the temporary full expensing of business assets, which is a really fantastic way of helping cash flow and getting business to invest. Because as businesses invest, that creates economic activity. So one person's spending is another person's income. The second largest spending item in the budget is the personal income tax cuts. So bringing forward those tax cuts from 1st of July 2022 to 1st of July this year. So bring forward and backdated is going to put $17 billion into people's pockets this year. And as you just heard, we agree that that's money well spent, and that money will go into people's pockets as a permanent reduction in their tax, so a permanent increase in their take-home pay, and a large chunk of that's going to be spent. The extension of the JobKeeper program is the next most expensive item, about $15 billion, and you can see the other items there in the slide. So here's a long list of all the things that are in the budget. We wanted to highlight. So as I mentioned, you've already heard a few of those. The personal income tax cut's really important. There's a little bit more money for pensioners, so 2 more $250 payments. The other things I wanted to highlight is these incentives for businesses to invest and incentives for businesses to employ people. Both of those really important. So the automatic write-off of investment up to unlimited for businesses up to $5 billion turnover, I think really important measure, and the feedback we're getting is that will help a lot, as well as the carryback of losses. So you can take losses from this year and, if you like, offset them against profits and tax paid in previous years. So that should help cash flow. And then there's the measures to encourage businesses to employ trainees and apprentice, and also to employ young people, 16 to 35-year-olds. Now, there's a bit of a worry, particularly for people like me with lots of grey hair, that would mean businesses just sack all their 55-year-olds and employ lots of 25-year-olds. But my understanding is to get access to this money, you have to increase your workforce. So you have to actually add on new people in that 16 to 35-year-old age group to access the government money. So I think that's an important. Other good things in the budget were the Modern Manufacturing Initiative, Regional Australia initiatives, National Water Infrastructure. All those are really welcome. But I would support what we've just heard from the previous speaker, that probably the areas that are a bit light on is anything around climate change and energy policy and childcare. So we really need to continue to increase female labour force participation, and it's, I think, a pretty well understood view that making childcare cheaper and more readily available is probably the best way to increase female labour force participation, and we're going to need to see that. Also, aged care funding was probably a bit light on, but what I've heard is the government's waiting for the final report of the Royal Commission into aged care before they actually come up with some more money on that front. So talking about the economy, So it's a deep recession, but we're already past the worst. So the worst point for the economy was in the June quarter. And I can show you in a moment, things are already improving. And so that's a very good outcome, but it will take until early 2022 before the economy is back to where it was pre-COVID. As you heard earlier, the government's assuming a vaccine is available for all Australians by the end of next year. We are not assuming that in our forecasts. If that's the outcome, then that's fantastic. That's your best case scenario, that we've all got a vaccine that works and we all take it by the end of next year. So our forecast for the economy in 2021 and 2022 is lower than the government because we're not assuming a vaccine. But one of the pleasing aspects is it looks like the unemployment rate has peaked at a lot lower level than people feared. So the early forecast where the unemployment rate would peak at 10%, and now looks like it's peaked at about 7.5%. We actually get the September employment numbers today, and we're forecasting a slight increase in the unemployment rate from 6.8% in August to 7% in September. So I can show you here on the left-hand side, we can see how much money people spend on their CBA credit or debit card each week. And if you look on the left-hand side there, that's the annual change in spending on CBA credit and debit cards. And we account for just under 30% of all the cards out there, which is the largest share. And you can see spending in the third quarter was definitely higher than it was in the second quarter. And here we are at the start of the fourth quarter in October, and things have picked up a little bit as well. And if you look at the middle chart, you can look at retail spending. You can see really the source of weakness is just Victoria because of the shutdown there. So most of the other states are actually spending more. People are spending more than they were pre-COVID, but not Victoria, for, I would imagine, the obvious reasons. And you can see we've always seen hours worked done picked up as well. Again, this is just on the labour market, so you can see the unemployment rate already beginning to trend down, although the point we heard earlier, which was there's a lot of underemployment. So to be counted as employed, you can be working 1 or 2 hours a week. If you're on JobKeeper, and even if you're working 0 hours a week, if you're on JobKeeper, you're counted as employed. So we definitely want to see hours worked increase quite significantly. Inflation's very low, likely to remain low with all this spare capacity in the economy. We think inflation remains below the Reserve Bank's target range, which is 2 to 3%, probably around 1 to 1.5%. So not much inflation coming down the line. We can see here, this is money flowing into CBA bank accounts. So on the right-hand side, this is a really important chart, I think. We can split up income coming into CBA bank accounts between wages and salaries and government benefits. So the blue line, the blue bar is wages and salaries being paid into CBA bank accounts, and it's the annual change. And you can see pretty easy the COVID period, and then things drop pretty significantly. Now the wages and salaries component includes JobKeeper. So that comes into a bank account looking like it's a wage. And you can see the growth on wages and salaries is about 0. But the red bars is government benefits. So job seeker and the money being paid to pensioners and other welfare recipients. And that's increasing at about 10% per annum. So there's actually more money, more income coming into bank accounts now than there was pre-COVID. So I'll say that again, there's more money coming in now than pre-COVID, which is an amazing outcome. And that's basically the government money just hitting bank accounts. So government's done an excellent job in just pushing income into people's bank accounts. Now the question is, what happens when these government benefits fade away? And so we're going to need to watch towards the end of this year and then March next year. So the government strategy is to try and perfectly calibrate a reduction in government benefits at the same time as private income comes up, because people will go back to working and working more hours. So, you know, perfectly calibrating the decline in government subsidies with an increase in private employment is going to be a very difficult thing to do. And that's why people are saying it's going to be a bumpy ride, you know, so things are not smooth. but that's the strategy. And we can see from this chart that to date, a large share of the income coming in has been saved. So the chart on the left-hand side is a measure of savings inside CBA bank accounts, and that includes people who have accessed their super early. So there's $33 billion of money being taken out of superannuation and put into bank accounts. And so people say, well, this means the government stimulus is not working, it's been saved. But the point is, that's money in people's bank accounts. They can spend it any time they want. So over the coming weeks and months and years, we've got this big pool of savings now available to be spent. And then you add on the income tax cuts, and it's it's a lot of money that people will have available to spend over coming weeks, months, and years to support the economy. So just on spending, we've already mentioned that we can see spending is actually now increased. This is through the CBA credit and debit cards. And you can see, not surprisingly, a lot of that increase is in online spending rather than in-store, and particularly, again, in Victoria. So we can see a breakdown here. Look at in-store spending on the left. Every other state's going well, Victoria, terrible. Spending on alcohol, spending on clothing and footwear. So you can see that all the weakness in all these items is Victoria. Transport, household furnishing and equipment, food. Again, this is all the spending on CBA credit and debit cards. So all the weakness is in Victoria. So, touch wood, as Victoria comes out of the lockdown, we actually should see national spending increase quite significantly. This is another chart that kind of is a little bit mind-blowing. So personal insolvencies. We're in the middle of the worst recession since World War II, and personal insolvencies are at the lowest level in 20 years. And of course, this is the support being provided to people and businesses, and the change in the directors' obligations. So, companies can basically now trade while insolvent. And of course, the banking system has paused on repayments. So the big concern is what happens when you're going to go back to normal. Banks actually get people to repay the money they owe. The change in directors' obligations comes through. So we're going to have to watch this really closely, the so-called zombie firms. So, not every business is going to survive, but we really hope most of them do. We're going to have big increase in infrastructure spending. So this is really supportive for growth, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales. So the more that we can get done on these infrastructure projects, the better, and not just the gigantic transport projects in Sydney and Melbourne, but right across the regions. And you can see in the budget a lot of focus on water infrastructure as well. One of the things we've already heard about is population growth. So the population growth of Australia is going to drop from 400,000 people a year to 180,000 this year. That's a massive decline, and that's going to have ramifications right across the economy. And one area you'll see that is housing. So we are expecting a decline in residential construction, but house prices are holding up reasonably well. So we're expecting peak to trough decline in house prices of 6%. Previously, we were expecting 10%, so that's an upgraded forecast. And we've actually seen, if you look on the chart on the left-hand side, this is home loan approvals are rocketing higher. So the very low interest rates are seeing people become much more active in trying to get a home loan. Lower prices, very low interest rates. If you've kept your job and your income has been pretty good, people are trying to jump into the housing market. So that's a positive sign as well. So we do think the Reserve Bank keeps interest rates very low for a long time, at least another 3 years. We'll be at 0.25% for the cash rate or lower, and that's going to support spending right across the economy, but particularly spending by the government. And last but not least, Aussie dollar. Our forecast is a stronger Aussie dollar over the next year or so. So we're forecasting 75 cents at the end of this year and 78 cents at the end of next year. Some of that is dependent on what happens in the US election, but we could probably spend a whole hour talking about that. So I'm going to stop talking now and we'll go to questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Shawn. These were great presentations. We really appreciate your time today. You answered a fair bit of my questions, but I guess one that came up was about being a service-led economy. If either of you could, or maybe Stephen, it might be for you. you know, we're very much service-led economy, but where are they receiving assistance? How can people be spending with our service-based businesses?
Yeah, well, you're right. We are a service-led economy. Around 65–70% of the economy is services. And if we look at, you know, where the jobs have been lost, you know, it's really clear. It's in hospitality, it's in, you know, cafes, restaurants, tourism sector, all these service parts of the economy. So the recovery for those parts of the economy is get income into people's pockets so they'll go and spend it, but you need to have the confidence to get out and about around the economy, right? So removing the shutdowns in Victoria and expanding opportunities to get around out and about here in New South Wales is going to be critical. Now, we were going to be getting some changes in those rules this week, and then we've now, I think we had 11 cases yesterday, or maybe 13, and so there's some delay in that, and so that's concerning. So for the services economy, you need a combination of money in people's pockets, so that's right, but an easing of the restrictions and some confidence to actually get back out in the streets. So, you know, I'm here in Sydney CBD, and most buildings, including our building, we're running at 25% capacity. So the city of Sydney looks pretty dead. That's probably good for the regions because people are working from home, so they go to the local coffee shop instead of being here in the city. But we're going to need to see that change for sure.
Yeah, and look, it was great to see the insights from CBA and having those extra parts of the budget to compare where the spending and where the money's being saved. But it is relying very much on a consumption economy and the private sector to spend. And obviously you see that with the asset write-offs. But are people going to be willing to spend when they're trying to survive at this time?
Well, that's the $64 million question, right? So I think the answer is yes, but slowly. So, you know, as I mentioned, and yeah, I think Dr. Liu said the same thing, it's going to take until early, or at least not the mid of 2022, before the economy is back to where it was pre-COVID. So, you know, it's not going to go back quickly. The unemployment rate will decline only very slowly. So we're in for a long haul here. But I'd much rather be here than just about anywhere else on the planet, to be honest.
We are pretty lucky. Yeah. Dr. Liu, you mentioned about, you know, one of the assumptions is providing a vaccine, and, you know, whilst there's speculation that there might be a vaccine at the end of next year, if it does take longer, what do you feel are going to be the greatest impacts?
I think that as you can see from the different graphs that Stephen has provided, that as soon as there appears to be a little window opening, that people are fairly eager to actually get out there and get back to their normal lifestyle and spending habits. So you can see the pickup very quickly, except Victoria, where because of the need to control the pandemic, so there is that artificial repression of economic activity, if you like. I think the issue here is that if it takes much longer than expected for the vaccine to be successfully developed and implemented, then there is a greater risk that there is going to be not just this sort of temporary repression of economic activity and the higher unemployment, but perhaps we run into a greater risk that there is going to be more permanent scarring, that you know, firms are looking sort of to change the way they operate. They probably casualize more and hire, you know, and so on. So I think that's probably the risk, that the longer it takes for us to get a vaccine going to settle everything down, maybe that there is going to be much more permanent scarring to be taking place in the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really affecting immigration and making a major impact on even our universities, because of, you know, the not being allowed to have people here, and because of the vaccine not being with the immigration. So you touched on that. Did you have any further comments around immigration?
So, you know, for example, if you look at the university sector, I mean, UNE is, you know, our exposure to international students is probably sort of towards the lower scale of the different universities in Australia, but it's a real concern for the university sector, for example, that the longer it's harder for international students to return in numbers, the more difficult it is for us to actually plan ahead. But also, you know, the worry that we might actually lose these international students to other international markets. And also, for example, that the Chinese students are now increasingly looking to study domestically. So that there is that real issue here that we might not be able to actually get the sort of inflows that we used to get prior to COVID shock.
Yeah. Well, I know that I've learnt a lot today, and I'd have to say this is the most interesting budget presentation I've been to in the last week. So thank you so much, gentlemen. And I think Rob had some closing statements.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah. I'd like to thank the speakers today. It certainly has been quite engaging, and hearing a broad range of you know, points of view and reflections there. You know, clearly, you know, there's some work the government can do with a budget coming up in you know, May next year. You know, so that's not that far away. So I really appreciate the time and the research that's gone into your presentations today. So thank you very much. I'd now like to call on to Luke McGee. He's the Vice President of the Chamber of Commerce. So over to you, Luke.
Look, thanks Rob, and thanks Sarah. Thanks Shawn, and thanks Stephen for another fantastic presentation from UNE. Like, the Parramatta Chamber and the UNE have had a long-standing relationship, and we really appreciate the partnership and the effort that goes into it on both sides. So thanks again to UNE and Rob. And I think we look forward to the next event, which is in a few months. Coming up in terms of Parramatta Chamber events, Ramina has very excitedly organised the Business After 5 in 2 weeks' time. So look out for that and make sure you book, because numbers are strictly limited. And then the Wasabi event is coming up towards the end of November. So make sure you book for that. So that's it from the Parramatta Chamber, and thanks again to Rob and all the speakers.
Thanks very much, everyone.